Thanks very much, Don. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge and congratulate LiveCorp and ALEC for what has been a tremendous conference and highly informative. As Don mentioned, AniMark is the independent company that was established by the livestock industry to implement the Livestock Global Assurance Program, or LGAP. If there is one program that truly reflects welfare beyond borders, then it is LGAP. Today, I'll be pleased to provide you with an overview of AniMark, and I'll also explore some of the important elements of LGAP itself. As many in the room will appreciate, the LGAP has been a long-running industry initiative, so it's important for me to give you an update as to what's been happening in recent years. The foundation research began in 2012, and the dedicated LGAP development project was undertaken by Schuster Consulting between 2014 to 16. The development of LGAP has been funded through the Livestock Export Program. At the LIVEXchange conference in 2015, Peter Schuster presented the outcome of the project to the industry, namely an international certification program that had been piloted successfully. It was acknowledged at the time that the development of LGAP was a very detailed process involving significant consultation and research. Building on the work of Schuster Consulting, the LGAP Implementation Steering Committee, known as LISC, examined the commerciality of the program and proposed a new business model to deliver the program. The LISC committee included primary producers, livestock export and government representatives, and they also developed the policy framework for how the program and the government would interact. The LISC committee handed down its report in September 2017. Now, the research project conducted by Schuster Consulting recommended a program owner to administer LGAP. The program owner was recommended to be a company limited by guarantee and independent of government and at an arm's length from industry. The final recommendation from the LISC supported this recommendation, and the industry made its final resolutions to move forward with the company and establish the LGAP company in March 2018. AniMark was incorporated in Australia in June that year. In accordance with the recommendations, arrangements were made to create the new company. The members of the company comprised LiveCorp, ALEC, the Cattle Council of Australia, Sheep Producers Australia, and the Goat Industry Council of Australia. An initial board of 3 members was appointed in June 2018, and they were supported in their work by LiveCorp. The new board began a recruitment process for a CEO and began meeting with government and other key stakeholders, and they worked with LiveCorp to establish the necessary corporate governance frameworks. An additional 2 directors were appointed in March 2019, and that made a board of 5 independent, non-executive, skills-based directors. The board developed a strategic framework and has articulated the company's purpose as to set standards and monitor conformance for the ethical handling and management of livestock. Consistent with the development project's vision, AniMark has been built on the foundations of independence, integrity, and transparency. The company's vision is to be the international leader in the certification of agricultural supply chains. This includes managing the evaluation, auditing, and certifying of entities under these programs, as well as overseeing the conformity management process. Through the execution of its responsibilities, AniMark will support the international trade of livestock. The Australian Government has committed a 4-year funding package of $8.3 million to support the launch of LGAP. I commenced in January this year and worked with the board to continue and accelerate the company's work streams. A number of key milestones have been achieved in the company's first 12 months. We've executed a funding deed with government. Corporate governance arrangements have been put in place, including the Constitution, company policies, budgets, trademark protections. We've established a small office in Brisbane with 3 employees so far. We've validated the budgets and financial forecasts, and we've provided an implementation plan to government. There are 3 significant objectives that must be achieved prior to the launch in market. We need to bed down the AniMark business model, and considerable discussions have been conducted in this regard. We need to commission an IT system to operate LGAP, and most importantly, we need to secure the regulatory approval of the Australian Government. AniMark needs to be approved as a third-party provider of assurance services. So this mechanism allows for the department to accept an exporter's certification under LGAP and their use of importers and facility certifications as a means of demonstrating compliance with SCAS. Now, there are legislative requirements that are required in order for AniMark to operate as a third-party provider, and the department is undertaking the necessary processes to enact the changes and advise us that the approvals could be provided in early to mid-2020. So I'd like to take some time to re-familiarise you with LGAP and how the program operates. LGAP is a certification program that is applicable to any organisation in any country wanting to demonstrate their commitment to the ethical and sustainable animal welfare management practices. LGAP aims to foster world's best practice and encourage continuous improvement. The LGAP standards have been developed based on science, research and international precedents. LGAP does not replace SCAS. SCAS will remain in place as the Australian Government's regulatory framework. But importantly, LGAP is not self-regulation. It can be considered a regulatory enabler and provides an alternative means for exporters to demonstrate compliance with SCAS. LGAP is a facility-based program for exporters, importers, feedlots, farms and abattoirs. The scheme is voluntary and will operate on a fee-for-service basis. LGAP applies to feeder and slaughter cattle, sheep, goats and buffalo in overseas markets from the point of disembarkation to the point of slaughter. You'll be familiar with the SCAS framework, which is based on the 4 key principles of control, traceability, animal welfare standards and independent auditing. A number of export advisory notices or EINs provide additional information, and there are numerous supplementary documents providing guidance. LGAP comprises a suite of standards and rules which together form the LGAP certification requirements. The certification requirements reflect the 4 principles of SCAS and place obligations on certified parties regarding their management systems, which is in line with the additional guidance provided through the SCAS EINs. There is also a substantial suite of manuals, training materials and guides that support the program. There will be an IT system, and this will provide a powerful tool for exporters to help them to monitor conformance through their supply chain. Now, AniMark has not made any changes to the standards and rules since the original research project, but we did conduct a review of the more recent EINs from the department, and we'll have to have some minor updates to that prior to launch to ensure that it's continued to be compliant with SCAS. LGAP is applicable to operators, which are exporters and importers, and facilities, with feedlots, farms and abattoirs. Unlike SCAS, certification is granted at a facility or operator level. AniMark will not be approving supply chains. To receive and maintain certification, operators and facilities are required to implement specific business and livestock management practices. They'll be required to undertake internal audits, external audits, and undergo random audits. AniMark will appoint independent approved certification bodies to the operator or the facility. The approved certification body is responsible for undertaking regular external audits and overseeing the conformity management process. This ensures that non-conformities are resolved within set timeframes. Auditors must be under contract to an approved certification body in order to undertake LGAP audits. Auditors will be approved by AniMark, and we will assign them to operators and facilities. This is obviously different to SCAS, where the exporter is responsible for procuring an order. Independent audit is an important foundation of the program. To join the program, an operator or a facility will assess their own readiness and then submit an application to AniMark. They'll be required to undertake an internal audit in preparation for their first external audit. If there are any non-conformities, these will be recorded in the IT system and they will need to be closed out in the timeframes prescribed. Entities will be certified for 3 years and they'll be required to undertake regular internal and external audits throughout this time in accordance with their risk rating. Now, it's important to understand how non-conformities will be managed. A non-conformity is raised when there is objective evidence of a non-fulfilment of a requirement. A non-conformity may be raised in response to evidence obtained either through an audit or during an investigation triggered by a complaint. There are varying degrees of non-conformity, namely minor, major and critical. Now, the non-conformity management process ensures that organisations not meeting the required standards are provided with the opportunity to rectify practices before serious issues occur. The process is designed to ensure principles of procedural fairness and continual improvement apply. The approved certification body has the responsibility for overseeing this process. And this is, again, very different from the SCAS framework, where exporters have that key role in managing non-compliance. Where a non-conformity is identified, the approved auditor will issue a corrective action request, which the operator or the facility has the responsibility for rectifying or closing out. Once corrective action has been taken by the certified party, the approved auditor will then assess if the corrective action is sufficient to eliminate the root cause of a non-conformity and prevent recurrence. Then certification is granted or maintained. If a corrective action is not sufficient, the auditor will escalate the non-conformity. If issues are not resolved in the specified time frame, the escalation process can lead to suspension or withdrawal of certification. But parties do remain with their full rights until such time as they are suspended or their certification withdrawn. Non-conformity detection and management is a normal part of the continual improvement process. It's expected that non-conformities will occur. The focus is on the response, on the corrective action. And you'll note the significant role that the approved certification bodies and the approved auditors play in this management process, and then the oversight that AniMark will have into this process. We'll have also additional reporting obligations to government. Now, should an Australian exporter have their certification withdrawn under LGAP, then this is likely mean that they'll no longer be complying with SCAS. But the licensing arrangements remain the responsibility of the department, and the department will retain its right to suspend or cancel export licences. So certifying operators and facilities as individual entities brings enhanced flexibility. If you consider a simple supply chain where each entity is certified under LGAP, the market comprises a network of these operators and facilities across a number of supply chains. At any time, there may be operators or facilities that have had their certification suspended or withdrawn. LGAP allows trade to continue through the inherent flexibility of the program. There is less risk that entire supply chains could be shut down, as the scrutiny and accountability are applied to the operator or facility who have moved out of conformance. LGAP also strengthens the oversight and management of animal welfare through the supply chain through a chain of custody standard. LGAP ensures accountability and responsibility is placed upon the appropriate parties in the supply chain. The existing LGAP standards include requirements for the identification of livestock and the recording of the movements of livestock. These are the functions of underlying traceability. Now, there's been ongoing interest from industry for AniMark to investigate if additional traceability provisions could be provided by AniMark. LiveCorp has previously conducted some exploratory work in this regard, but as yet no definitive pathway forward has been determined. One of the key challenges is in devising an approach that caters to the diverse needs of different markets. There is an agreement that further work needs to be done in this area, and AniMark has proposed a research project to the LEP. we need to determine the most appropriate role that AniMark can play in support of the industry. The project will need to consider data collection and ownership, sovereign and legal considerations, and the commercial viability of any approach. AniMark does intend to launch LGAP with the existing LGAP standards and certification rules, which still require participants to have provisions in place for control and traceability in compliance with SCAS. A review of SCAS in 2015 found that the system had done much to help improve the welfare and treatment of exported livestock. However, this review also found that the short development time had resulted in a system which was at times clunky, rigid and complex. As a regulatory framework, SCAS can only be applied to exporters. By contrast, LGAP is an international conformity assessment program which can be applied through the full supply chain. So what are the benefits for each group? For exporters, LGAP enables exporters to demonstrate their commitment to the ethical animal welfare practices, and it provides an alternate means to demonstrate their compliance with SCAS. The program clearly defines exporters' responsibilities consistent with their compliance obligation and has been designed to enhance market stability and security. Consequences of non-conformity are applied directly to the party responsible, which reduces the risk of disrupting entire supply chains. Compared to SCAS, LGAP more clearly defines expectations for control and traceability and shares accountability more equitably throughout the supply chain. For in-country participants, countries importing Australian livestock will have surety of access to Australian livestock. While elements of LGAP may bring some unfamiliar obligations and accountabilities, these are entirely consistent with the expectations under SCAS. Participation in the program may become important for access to Australian stock. Through LGAP certification, facilities and operators may trade under a more flexible arrangement than currently exists. And LGAP provides a roadmap and incentives towards adopting best practice. LGAP enables facilities certification status to be shared between supply chains, which eliminates audit duplication and cost. And most importantly, facilities and operators genuinely operating and upholding SCAS requirements will be able to demonstrate conformance under LGAP. For regulators, LGAP provides an evidence-based approach to assist the Australian Government in regulating the export industry. LGAP does not replace SCAS, but it serves as a regulatory enabler. It strengthens the impartiality of the audit process and places strict requirements on auditors to ensure appropriate levels of competency and conduct. AniMark approves, contracts and pays for audit companies and introduces centralised oversight and monitoring of their performance. The program allows for direct accountability at facility level, which is usually beyond the reach of the Australian Government. And the program also has mechanisms to place in place to monitor and manage conformity during the inter-audit gap, and it provides more timely visibility into non-conformities. AniMark has a very clear line of sight as to the events and milestones that must be achieved prior to launching in market. We need to achieve 3 critical milestones: secure regulatory approval, commission an IT system and bed down the business model. The launch of LGAP will be for all components of LGAP, including conformance, system, training and auditing. AniMark is establishing itself as an independent, professional organisation which is on track to successfully implement LGAP. The foundations of the company are independence, integrity and transparency. LGAP promotes the humane and ethical treatment of livestock, and LGAP delivers practical mechanisms to demonstrate compliance with SCAS. The program places clear, unambiguous requirements and consequences on those who more immediately impact animal welfare and management on a day-to-day basis. LGAP is not self-regulation, but it is a regulatory enabler. By supporting and implementing LGAP, the industry is taking a proactive step towards continuous improvement and taking important steps towards building community trust in the live export trade. LGAP will truly help deliver welfare beyond borders. Thank you.
Thanks, Eliot. There's a huge risk in asking for questions at this hour of the day on a topic such as deep as this one, but I'll take a punt and risk it in the hope that, yes, you've got some questions, but please, I'm asking you not to sort of enter into a massively detailed discussion this afternoon. Eliot, you're around tonight?
I am.
Yeah. So after 4 or 5 glasses of red wine, I'm sure you'll solve all the problems.
That's when I do my best work.
That's right. We all do, of course. So have we any 1 or 2 serious burners just at the moment? I did my best to scare you. Oh, Dickie had a way, so.
My question is, have you reviewed the legality and your sovereignty when you go into other countries? I find this, for us, when we embark on ASCAS, it was not easy for us to convince our government. And for us to go into this system, we have to lobby. We have to convince our government, which they have their sovereignty as far as compliance, licenses and everything. That is something that you have to look into that, because as an importers, I would not jeopardize my relationship with the government. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for the question, Dickie, and I think that's a very important point. We are in a process of establishing our regulatory approvals and building the foundations of the company right now. We appreciate it. We've still got a very large task ahead of us in building awareness and communicating the benefits of the program to people in country. And part of that process will be engaging with foreign governments and explaining exactly what the program is and what it isn't. And as I mentioned during the presentation, the key thing is that it's a voluntary program. So there's no overarching legislative requirement for people to participate in the program. So it will be on a voluntary basis, and it should make sense. It should make sense for people participating both in Australia and overseas.
How are we going? Well, question, is it? Yep. Just hold on, we'll give you the mic.
When you say it's a voluntary program, how long will that be voluntary, and when will that become compulsory?
So voluntary is voluntary, so there's no time limit on it. SCAS still remains the regulatory framework, and for those who want to participate in LGAP, they've got that opportunity, but it's not forced upon them.
Thank you.